Hello and welcome to our lecture on demand pull and cost push inflation by Renita and Renusha. One might ask, why does the cost of milk and eggs keeps going up year after year? Why does the same model vehicle you purchased last year now cost $400 more? If you really want the accurate answers to those questions, you must first gain an understanding of what demand pull and cost push inflation is. First, let's recap what inflation is. Inflation is the rate at which general prices of goods and services rises. As inflation rises, the dollar you have in your pocket won't buy the same amount of goods and services as it did before. For example, if inflation is 5%, pizza that cost you $5 will cost you $5.25 next year. Inflation can result because of four main factors, where cost-push inflation is most closely tied to the supply of goods going down, whereas demand-pull inflation is most closely tied to the demand for goods and services going up. Let's explore each of these types of inflation in more details. Demand-pull inflation is a term used to describe when prices rise because the aggregate demand in an economy is greater than the aggregate supply. This imbalance essentially results in too much money chasing too few goods and services. There are four main factors which can often cause this demand-driven inflation. The first is a growing economy. When families feel confident, they spend more instead of saving. They expect to get raises and better jobs. Usually, the companies cannot catch up with this increased demand, and thus they increase prices. A real-life example can be taken in the 80s from the British economy when they experienced rapid economic growth. The government cut tax rates and house prices rose about 30%, which fueled the positive wealth effect. Thus, consumer confidence soared. This led to higher spending and borrowing and lower saving. The rate of economic growth reached at 5% per year, and thus this led to a rise in inflation since companies could not catch up with the demand. The second factor is the expectation of inflation. Once people expect inflation, they will buy things now to avoid higher future prices. That increases the demand, which then creates demand-pull inflation. For example, businesses in the US expected higher interest rates and inflation in the 70s, which then resulted in a galloping inflation. Thus, Bernanke was the first US Federal Reserve chairman who set an inflation target of 2%. That is because a healthy economy grows between 2 and 3% of inflation. The third cause is overexpansion of the money supply. That typically occurs when the government prints too much money. To explain it better, right here we have Zimbabwean banknotes of $10 trillion. Some of you may ask, how much is that worth in euros? But the fastest answer is, not very much. In Zimbabwe, over a 9-year period of time, prices increased 4.5 trillion%, so you can comprehend how fast prices were going up there. The fourth cause is discretionary fiscal policy. Government spending drives up the demand, for example by lowering the taxes. That is because consumers have more discretionary income to spend on goods and services. When that increases faster than the supply, it creates inflation. Cost-push inflation is the idea that prices increase due to increases in wages, raw materials, indirect taxes, and other input factors. Simply stated, prices are pushed up by increases in the costs to produce. Cost-push inflation only occurs when demand is inelastic, since people cannot easily buy less of milk, for example, no matter how high its price goes. Three main factors can often cause this cost-push inflation. First, companies that achieve a monopoly over an industry create cost-push inflation. A good example is OPEC, when they created cost-push inflation during the 70s oil embargo. When OPEC restricted oil in 1973, its prices were quadrupled. Wage inflation is the second creator of cost-push inflation. That is, when workers have enough leverage to force through wage increases. Companies then pass higher costs through to consumers. A third driver, or the last driver, of the cost-push inflation is government regulation and taxation. Taxes on cigarettes and alcohol were meant to lower demand for these unhealthy products. That may have happened, but more important is that it raised the price, thus creating inflation. This is all from the demand pull and cost-push inflation lecture. Thank you for watching us.
Created using Powtoon.